They held the auction in the old county gym, tin roof, folding chairs, voices bouncing like marbles. I stood by the fire exit, palms cold though the room was hot. A banner read, "Distressed estate sale." That morning, I waited. People think they know me because Patricia does. They don't. My name is June Whitlow. Patricia, my mother-in-law, arrived in pearls and fury. 2 rows ahead, she turned, chin high. "There you are," she said, letting it echo. "Our jinx. You destroyed our fortune," she added, red nail aimed at my face. "Your budgets, your small-town thinking. If Edward hadn't married you..." Edward wasn't here. Patricia leaned close, perfume like gardenias. "If you had any shame," she whispered, "you'd leave." "I'm staying," I said. "I came for the farm." "To watch it go?" "Enjoy the view." Lot 1, a tractor. Lot 2, the irrigation rig Edward financed without reading the balloon clause. He said we needed it to scale. When we married, I thought I'd joined a family that loved land the way my grandfather taught me. Count the soil with your hands, save in the good season for the bad. Then the bad season came, and I became the villain. Lot 3, the auctioneer called. North Creek parcel. 37 acres, pecan stand, west barn. Opening bid, $400,000. Patricia straightened her pearls and gave me a look that said, "Watch." I watched developers who could say heritage for a camera and the cousin I'd cooked for raise a paddle for sport. The bids climbed, 420, 450, 470. At 500, Patricia rose. She didn't bid. "Look at her," she said, pointing. She told Edward to cut back. She starved the business. She's a curse. The auctioneer tried to move on. I could have said 100 things. How I sold my car to cover payroll, begged her to co-sign a refinance, found the second mortgage after a poker night ran long. I said none of it. 520, the auctioneer called. 550, said a man in a gray suit. Going once, going twice. I lifted my paddle. 600. 600 from bidder 417, the auctioneer said. "Do I have 610? The man in the gray suit hesitated, then lowered his paddle. 600. Going once. Patricia spun, eyes wide. "Where did you don't have..." I kept my eyes on the banner, distressed. I thought of the file in my purse, an LLC formed 2 months ago, a cashier's check from a lender who doesn't take walk-ins, and a clause in my father-in-law's trust neither of them respected. Right of first refusal on core parcels sold under distress. "Going twice? If you do this," she hissed, "you'll never set foot in my house again." I saw the girl she'd been, sure fortune meant love and status meant safety, and the woman she became, furious atop a mountain of other people's work. Sold. The hammer fell. Lot 3 to 417 for 600,000. I lowered my paddle. I didn't smile. My palms were no longer cold. I came for the farm. I came for the truth. Whether Patricia liked it or not, I had just bought both. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. The air inside the county gym felt too heavy for a Tuesday morning. Sunlight pressed in through high windows, making the polished concrete floor shine like a stage. Rows of folding chairs faced the podium at the front, where a red-faced auctioneer adjusted his microphone. And scattered through the crowd, like buzzards over a carcass, were developers, lawyers, and nosy neighbors, all waiting to pick apart what was left of my husband's family fortune. I stood near the back, just behind the final row. I wasn't hiding, I just wanted space. Patricia, my mother-in-law, had made it clear that my presence was unwelcome. But this was my fight too. I had worked the books, negotiated vendor payments, cut expenses, and even sold my own car trying to keep the property afloat. And still, here we were. Auction day. Patricia entered moments later, and as usual, the room seemed to bow around her. She wore a cream suit and a string of pearls that looked like they cost more than my wedding dress. Edward, my husband, trailed 2 steps behind, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Her eyes found me almost immediately. Her expression twisted, lips curling with disgust. Then, just as the auctioneer was about to speak, she turned toward the crowd and raised her voice, ensuring everyone would hear. "There she is," she said, pointing directly at me. "The jinx who ruined this family." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. My stomach turned cold. "You destroyed our fortune," she continued, voice trembling with anger. "My husband built this empire over 40 years, and you, with your cost-cutting ideas and your small-town nonsense, you flushed it all away." I didn't move. I didn't speak. Because the truth was far more complicated. Edward's reckless investments, Patricia's refusal to modernize operations, and her own sabotage of a refinance deal were what drove us here. But none of that mattered right now. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin shortly. Please take your seats." Patricia turned her back on me, but her words hung in the air like smoke. I gripped the paddle I had tucked under my coat, the one I swore I'd raise before the day was over. They thought they were selling off my future. They had no idea I'd come to buy it back. 3 years earlier, I had stood on the same land they were about to sell, 400 acres of rolling vineyards, centuries-old oak trees, and a white farmhouse that looked like something out of a painting. Back then, it wasn't the Carmichael estate in my mind. It was home. When I married Edward, I believed I was joining a family legacy. He told me stories of generations of hard work, of how his father had turned a modest plot of land into one of the most respected wineries in the region. I pictured us raising our children here, expanding the business together, and eventually passing it down to them. But the reality of being a Carmichael daughter-in-law was far colder. Patricia never called me by my name. I was always that girl, or Edward's little charity case. At family dinners, she would talk over me as if I weren't there, correcting every word I said. Once, she even asked me, in front of the entire table, if I knew how to hold a wine glass properly. Still, I tried. I studied viticulture, took accounting classes to manage the books, and proposed cost-saving strategies that would keep the vineyard profitable. Edward encouraged me at first, but when his mother scoffed at my ideas, he stopped defending them. And me. "You don't understand how things are done here," Patricia would say. "We don't cut corners on legacy, but corners needed cutting. They were hemorrhaging money, bad loans, expensive equipment they didn't need, and a disastrous attempt to expand into real estate." I saw the numbers. We had maybe 18 months before the bank came knocking. I begged them to sell a parcel of unused land to stabilize the finances. Patricia called me short-sighted. I proposed a joint venture with a boutique distributor. Patricia said I was trying to cheapen the brand. Then came the breaking point. Edward borrowed against the vineyard to fund a speculative investment without telling me. When it collapsed, we were deeper in debt than ever. And somehow, in Patricia's mind, I was the reason everything fell apart. Now, watching her sit front row at the auction, I realized something. I had spent years trying to belong to this family. But they were never going to see me as one of them, and that meant I was free to stop playing their game and start building my own. The breaking point came on a cold, January morning, the day the bank representative knocked on our door. I remember the frost still clinging to the vineyard rows, the distant hum of the harvest machines, and the way Patricia's porcelain teacup trembled slightly as she read the letter. "Foreclosure proceedings," she whispered, as if the words were poisonous, "unless the outstanding balance is paid in full within 90 days. Edward was pacing the kitchen, running his hands through his hair. "We can negotiate," he insisted. "They'll give us an extension. They always do." But I knew this wasn't like the other times. I had seen the ledgers, the missed payments, the compounding interest. The bank had given us more leniency than we deserved. "We're out of time," I said quietly. "We either restructure or lose everything." Patricia slammed the letter on the table. "This is your fault," she hissed. "We were fine until you started meddling with the finances. Your penny pinching, your ridiculous modernization plans, all of it ruined us." I felt my face burn. I was trying to save the vineyard, I said, my voice shaking. It was Edward's real estate deal that— Don't you dare blame my son, she snapped, her voice rising. He's trying to expand this family's legacy. You're the one dragging us down. Edward said nothing. He just kept pacing, avoiding my eyes. And that silence, that cowardly silence, hurt more than Patricia's words. That night, I packed a suitcase. Not because I was leaving, but because I needed space. I drove 2 towns over and spent the night in a cheap motel, staring at the cracked ceiling and wondering how my life had unraveled so quickly. The next morning, Edward called. Please come home, he said. We'll figure this out. Together. I almost laughed. There was no together. There was me, the scapegoat, and them, the Carmichaels, clinging to their illusions of grandeur. But I did go back. Not because I believed in saving the marriage or the vineyard. I went back because I wasn't done fighting. If they were going to blame me for losing everything, then I was going to make damn sure I was part of how this story ended. And deep down, I had a plan forming, one they'd never see coming. The envelope arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a bland, official-looking thing slipped under the front gate by a courier. Patricia was the one who found it. She stood in the foyer, holding it as if it were a death sentence. And in many ways it was. It's over, she muttered, her voice trembling just enough to betray her fury. They're seizing the vineyard. Edward snatched the papers from her hands, scanning them with pale, shaking fingers. They're scheduling an auction, he whispered. March 12th. The land, the main house, everything. I stood frozen. We had known this was a possibility, but seeing it in writing, public auction, felt like a knife in my chest. This was more than land. It was generations of sweat and soil, a living memory of Edward's late father and the life we had poured ourselves into. Patricia turned to me, her lips curling into a bitter smile. I hope you're happy, she spat. All your meddling, all your big ideas, and now strangers will trample our family's name. Patricia, Edward warned, but his voice lacked conviction. I swallowed hard. We still have 6 weeks, I said, clinging to logic because it was all I had left. There's a chance to restructure or nothing, she interrupted. You've destroyed this family. If Edward had married anyone else, we wouldn't be in this position. Her words hit harder than I expected. They weren't just about the vineyard. They were about me, about how I'd never belonged. In her eyes, I had always been the outsider, the girl from the wrong side of town who dared to step into their storied lineage. That night, I walked the vineyard alone. The rain had turned the earth to mud, and my boots sank deep into the soil that had once felt like home. I trailed my fingers over the vines, whispering silent apologies to the rows that had seen every chapter of our lives. 6 weeks. That was all we had. And yet, even as fear churned in my stomach, another feeling flickered beneath it, a spark of defiance. They thought this was the end. But they had no idea that I was already planning for the day the auction would become my beginning. The day of the estate valuation, a mandatory pre-auction event, was supposed to be a routine formality. But Patricia had other plans. The room was filled with real estate brokers, vineyard investors, and wealthy families from neighboring counties. They roamed the grounds with clipboards and calculators, murmuring about soil quality and market trends. I tried to stay composed, offering polite smiles and brief explanations about the property's features. This was still my home, after all, or had been. Then I heard her voice slice through the low chatter. See that woman over there? Patricia announced loudly, pointing directly at me. That's the jinx who ruined this estate. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The air seemed to freeze. Patricia, stop, Edward muttered under his breath, tugging at her arm. But she shook him off, her eyes burning with contempt. You all should know, she continued, her voice rising with every word. This property was worth $8 million before she came along. $8 million! And now we're lucky if we get 2. She destroyed our legacy. She destroyed my husband's dream. A ripple of whispers spread. The humiliation from Patricia's outburst still burned my cheeks days later. But nothing could have prepared me for the public spectacle she made at the auction itself. The courthouse steps were packed with people that morning, investors in tailored suits, estate agents holding tablets, and neighbors eager for gossip. To them, this was just another foreclosure sale. To me, it was the funeral of everything I'd fought to protect. As I walked toward the auction tent, Patricia's sharp, icy voice cut through the winter air. "Look at her," she hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. The outsider who wrecked a century of Carmichael history. Edward winced beside her but didn't stop her. He never did. Inside, the auctioneer's gavel echoed like a countdown to doom. Lot number 14, the Carmichael Vineyards. Opening bid, $1,200,000. I swallowed hard. This land had been valued at $8 million before Edward's disastrous investments. Now it was going to be sold for a fraction of its worth. A fire sale fueled by greed, pride, and betrayal. Bids flew quickly. 1.3, 1.5, 1.8 million. Each one was another nail in the coffin of the life I'd built. And then, as if to twist the knife deeper, Patricia leaned over to a wealthy couple seated beside us. "I hope you buy it," she whispered, though loud enough for me to hear. Anyone would be better than her. Maybe now our name can be cleansed. Something in me snapped. I turned to face her, my voice low but steady. "I didn't lose this vineyard, Patricia. Your son did, with his reckless spending, his failed ventures, his arrogance. I tried to save it," her face reddened. "Liar," she spat. "You poisoned this family the day you married into it." The auctioneer's gavel slammed down. "Sold for $2.2 million. A hush fell over the crowd. Patricia exhaled sharply, a twisted smile on her face. "Good riddance," she said. "Maybe now we can start over without the curse you brought." I didn't respond. I simply stood there, staring at the land that had been stolen from beneath my feet. But deep down, I was already forming a plan, one that would make Patricia eat every cruel word she had ever spoken. They thought I was finished. They were wrong. The real story hadn't even begun. The days following the auction were some of the darkest of my life. I had expected anger, bitterness, maybe even grief, but what I hadn't expected was the relentless blame. Patricia wasted no time rewriting the narrative. Every time a relative called to ask what had happened, she spun the same story. It was her fault. She meddled in the finances. She ruined Edward's expansion plans. She destroyed our future. Soon whispers spread like wildfire. At the grocery store, neighbors averted their eyes. At church, conversations died when I walked into the room. Even old friends from the vineyard stopped returning my calls. I had become the villain in a tragedy I hadn't written. Edward, meanwhile, retreated into silence. His shame was palpable, but instead of defending me, he withdrew, spending long hours at his office, coming home late, and sleeping on the far edge of the bed. One evening, I tried to reach him. "Edward, please. You know I didn't cause this. We were already in trouble before I even saw those books." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know anymore. Maybe you did make things worse. Maybe you should have trusted me instead of interfering." "Trusted you?" I repeated, stunned. "You drained our savings into that ridiculous resort deal. You mortgaged the land without telling me, and somehow I'm the problem?" He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor, a broken man clinging to his denial. That night, as Patricia's hateful words echoed in my head, I made a quiet promise to myself. If they wanted a villain, I'd stop trying to be their savior. I'd stop trying to earn their approval or fix the mess they had made. But I wasn't walking away defeated. No, I was going to rebuild, strategize, and reclaim what was mine. And when I did, they would have no choice but to see the truth. For now, though, I let them believe they'd won. Because the sweetest revenge begins when your enemies think you're powerless. And I was far from powerless. The Carmichaels had underestimated me. That mistake would cost them everything. 2 weeks after the auction, Patricia organized a family meeting at the old estate house, the one that had belonged to Edward's grandparents and now stood empty after the forced sale. She claimed it was to discuss next steps, but I knew better. It was a tribunal, and I was the accused. I walked into the living room and immediately felt the chill. Patricia sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, flanked by Edward's two sisters, Olivia and Margot, both with smug expressions that screamed, "We told you so." Edward was there too, looking pale and exhausted, unable to meet my eyes. "Thank you for coming," Patricia said coolly. "We need to talk about the future, our future. And I think we all agree that certain mistakes must never be repeated." I stayed silent. There was no point defending myself when the jury had already decided the verdict. Patricia folded her hands. "Edward will be taking on a new advisory board for his business ventures. Family only, people we can trust." "Family only," Olivia echoed, glancing pointedly at me. "And as for you," Patricia continued, her voice laced with venom, "we think it's best if you step back from all financial matters. Your interference has cost us dearly. If you truly care about this family, you'll do the right thing." "The right thing?" I repeated, my voice trembling, not with fear but with rage. "I saved this family from complete financial ruin." I begged Edward to stop before it was too late. "And instead of listening, you let greed run this family into the ground." "Watch your tone," Patricia snapped. "You're a guest here. Don't forget your place." There it was, the truth she had always wanted to say. I wasn't family. I was never going to be. I stood slowly, every muscle in my body burning with humiliation and fury. "Thank you for the reminder," I said, my voice steady now. "I know exactly where I stand. And soon, so will you." As I walked out, I caught Edward's eyes. He looked torn, ashamed, but he didn't speak. He didn't defend me, and in that silence, something inside me hardened. I wasn't just going to clear my name. I was going to take everything they thought they owned. That night, I sat alone in the guest room, the same one Patricia had suggested I stay in until the tension cooled. It was a humiliating demotion from the bedroom I'd shared with my husband, but at that moment I was beyond humiliation. I was angry in a way I had never been before. I stared at the ledger spread across my lap, the same one I'd secretly copied before Edward locked me out of the office. It was all there. The reckless investments, the fraudulent loans Edward had signed under the family trust, the offshore accounts Patricia had used to hide profits while blaming me for losses. They had built an empire on lies, and now that the foundation was crumbling, I was their scapegoat. My phone buzzed. A message from Margot. "Hope you learned your lesson. Some people just don't belong in families like ours." I exhaled slowly, fighting the tears that burned at the corners of my eyes. They really thought I was finished. They really believed I'd crawl away in shame, leaving them to salvage what little they had left. But that message, that arrogance, it was the final push I needed. I started making calls the next morning, to the accountant who had worked with Edward's father, to a property lawyer I'd met at a charity event, even to a discreet private investigator. I needed every piece of documentation I could find. I needed leverage. Then I reached out to someone else, my cousin Malcolm, a real estate developer with deep pockets and deeper connections. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I explained my situation, he didn't hesitate. "If the property goes up for sale again," Malcolm said, "I'll help you buy it. But you'll have to be smart, silent. Make them think you're out of the picture." "Oh," I replied, a steely calm settling over me. "I plan to be invisible. Until it's too late." As I hung up the phone, I felt something shift inside me, from victim to strategist, from scapegoat to hunter. They had underestimated me because they believed humiliation would break me. But humiliation wasn't my end. It was my beginning. The following morning, I packed a small suitcase and walked out of the Carmichael estate without telling anyone. I needed space, not just from Patricia and her venomous words, but from Edward too. His silence had become its own kind of betrayal, and I couldn't heal or think clearly under the same roof as the people plotting against me. I rented a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in months: control. I didn't have Patricia barging into my room to deliver her daily insults. And I didn't have Olivia or Margot whispering in corners as I walked by. I was free to breathe, to think, and most importantly, to plan, and plan I did. Every evening, I sat at the small kitchen table surrounded by stacks of documents, property deeds, trust agreements, auction records, and bank statements. The deeper I dug, the more corruption I found. Patricia had manipulated financial reports for years to hide poor decisions, and Edward had signed off on risky ventures without board approval. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was fraud, and if exposed, it could ruin them far beyond the loss of one estate. But this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The legacy I had helped build, the investments I had poured my time and soul into, and the respect they had stripped from me. One evening, I lit a candle on the table, a small ritual I had always done when I needed courage. As the flame flickered, I whispered to myself, "They called me a jinx. They said I destroyed their fortune, but I will rebuild it, and when I do, it will carry my name, not theirs." It wasn't just a declaration. It was a promise to myself, to the life I was going to create, and to the woman I refused to let them destroy. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet. But I knew one thing for certain. The next time I stood in an auction room, Patricia Carmichael would be the one watching me claim the future she tried so hard to erase, and she'd have no one to blame but herself. 3 months had passed since I left the Carmichael estate, but not a single day had gone by without hearing Patricia's words in my head. "You're a jinx. You destroyed our fortune." The humiliation had burned deep, but it had also become fuel, and by now the fuel had transformed into strategy. I sat across from Malcolm in a quiet corner of a private members club downtown. The room was filled with muted conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses, a far cry from the suffocating tension of the estate. Malcolm slid a stack of documents across the table toward me. "I pulled the foreclosure filings," he said. "The bank intends to liquidate 4 more parcels, 2 vineyards, the North Orchard, and the West Hill property. The auction is in 6 weeks." I flipped through the documents, my heart racing. Those parcels were the crown jewels of the Carmichael estate, the land Patricia had bragged about for decades, worth tens of millions combined. If they were up for sale, the family was on the brink of losing everything. "And if we buy them?" I asked, my voice low. "Then Patricia will be paying you rent if she wants to set foot on them," Malcolm replied with a grin. "But you'll have to use a shell corporation. If they know it's you, they'll fight tooth and nail." I nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "I'll set up a holding company under a trust. Quiet, clean, untraceable." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "You're really going through with this?" "This isn't revenge," I said, though we both knew it partly was. "It's reclamation. I built that business with Edward. My name might not be on the deeds, but my blood, sweat, and sleepless nights are in every acre of that land." We toasted the plan, and as I sipped my wine, I allowed myself a rare smile. Patricia thought she had crushed me, that she had erased me from their legacy. But I was about to return. Not as a desperate wife begging for a seat at the table, but as the silent owner of the table itself. And when the hammer fell at that auction, it would be me signing the deed. Not Patricia. Not Edward. Me. The next few weeks became a blur of quiet but relentless preparation. If I was going to outmaneuver Patricia and Edward, I couldn't afford a single mistake. My days were spent in meetings with lawyers, accountants, and real estate advisors, my nights buried in financial statements, trust documents, and auction regulations. Every signature, every clause, every loophole was a weapon I intended to use. One discovery in particular made my blood run cold, then boil with determination. Buried in a decades-old trust agreement Edward's father had established, I found a clause Patricia had clearly hoped no one would notice. It stated that if any portion of the Carmichael family's primary agricultural land was foreclosed or sold to a third party, the remainder of the estate would immediately lose its preferential tax status. In simple terms, It meant Patricia's empire would face a 40% tax penalty on all remaining properties if she lost even one major parcel, and she was about to lose 4. I closed the folder slowly, my hands trembling. Patricia had spent years playing the game like she was untouchable, belittling me, mocking my outsider's ignorance about old money and land law. But now her arrogance had left her exposed. If I won those parcels, she wouldn't just lose property. She'd lose everything. I decided to keep that discovery to myself for now. It was my ace in the hole, a card I would reveal only when the damage was irreversible. Meanwhile, I began constructing my new identity, a legal trust named Willow and Vine Holdings. On paper, it was a modest agricultural investment group. In reality, it was me. I secured a line of credit with Malcolm's backing, discreetly liquidated a few personal investments, and assembled a small team of trusted professionals sworn to confidentiality. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in. Patricia was ruthless. Edward, despite everything, still had influence. What if they found out? What if they stopped the sale before I could act? But every time that fear tried to root itself, I remembered Patricia's sneer when she called me a jinx. I remembered Edward's silence as his family humiliated me. I wasn't the jinx. I was the reckoning. Their day of reckoning was getting closer. 2 days later, I drove back to the Carmichael estate for the first time since I'd walked out months before. The gates still bore the family crest, but the once pristine grounds were showing signs of neglect. Overgrown hedges, peeling paint on the main house shutters, weeds creeping into the driveway. It was poetic. The empire Patricia had worshipped was crumbling, and she didn't even realize how close it was to total collapse. I told myself I was only there to collect the last of my things, but deep down I wanted to see them, to measure how desperate they had become. Patricia was in the drawing room when I arrived, sipping tea with Olivia and Margot. The room fell silent the moment I stepped in. Well, Patricia said coolly, setting her cup down. The prodigal daughter returns. Come to gloat, have you? I gave her a small, polite smile. Just came to pick up the last of my belongings, and to see how you're all doing. Worried about us now? Olivia sneered. How thoughtful. Edward entered a moment later, his eyes tired, his once confident posture slightly slouched. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. You could have called, he said softly. We'd have sent your things. It's fine, I replied. I wanted to see the place one last time. Patricia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. One last time? Don't be so dramatic. We may have lost a few properties, but the Carmichaels always land on their feet. Her bravado would have been more convincing if I hadn't noticed the stack of unpaid tax notices on the sideboard behind her, or the faint tremor in her hand as she lifted her teacup. I'm sure you will, I said, deliberately neutral. I wish you all the best. As I turned to leave, Patricia called after me. Just remember, dear, you'll always be nothing without this family. Without us, you're no one. I paused at the doorway and met her gaze. You might be right, I said calmly. But we'll see who's no one when the next auction comes around. Her smile faltered. A flicker of doubt passed across her face. Good. Let her wonder. Let her fear, because the next time we met she wouldn't be sipping tea in that room. She'd be bidding against me, and losing. The day after my unsettling visit to the estate, I received a call from Malcolm, his tone urgent. They know, he said. Someone tipped Patricia off about the parcels going to auction. She's moving fast, already securing bridge loans and pulling favors from old business partners. They're going to try and buy everything back. My pulse spiked. How soon? 2 weeks earlier than we expected, he replied grimly. They've petitioned the bank for an accelerated sale, claiming they can pay in cash. It was a clever move. Classic Patricia. She knew that if I didn't have the funds ready in time, I'd lose the opportunity before it even began, but she had underestimated me. I'll be ready, I said, more confident than I felt. Still, it meant I needed to accelerate everything. The shell company filings, the trust fund transfers, even the financing agreements with Malcolm's investors. I spent the next 72 hours in a storm of paperwork and meetings, sleeping barely 3 hours a night. Every detail had to be flawless. If Patricia even suspected I was behind Willow and Vine Holdings, she'd pull every dirty trick in the book to sabotage the bid. But just when I thought I had everything under control, another blow came. Edward showed up at my apartment one evening, unannounced. He looked disheveled, desperate. "I need your help," he said quietly. "We're losing everything. The vineyards, the houses, and even the trust accounts. I know you're angry, but we need you." I stared at him stunned. "Now you need me? After you let them humiliate me? After you stood by and said nothing?" "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But this is bigger than all of us. If you help, I'll make sure you're recognized for everything you did." It was tempting. The part of me that still loved him wanted to believe he was sincere. But I also knew this wasn't about love. This was about survival. His, not mine. "I'm sorry, Edward," I said softly, "but I'm not your savior anymore." As I closed the door behind him, I felt a surge of resolve. The Carmichaels were scrambling, desperate, terrified, and that was exactly where I wanted them. After Edward's desperate visit, I knew two things for certain. Patricia and her children were panicking, and they still had no idea I was the one pulling the strings. That ignorance was my greatest advantage, and I intended to guard it fiercely. With the accelerated auction now just 3 weeks away, I convened an emergency meeting with Malcolm and our small circle of trusted advisors. We sat around a polished mahogany table in a law office overlooking the city skyline, documents spread out like battle plans. "We're not going to bid directly under Willow and Vine," I announced. "It's too risky. If Patricia even suspects I'm connected, she'll attempt to block the sale legally." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "So what's the play?" "We use a proxy," I explained. "A silent investor, someone with no obvious ties to me but who answers only to us. Once the deal is done, the ownership will quietly transfer back into the trust." It was an aggressive move, but it was the only way to ensure Patricia never saw me coming. We quickly identified a candidate, Malcolm's associate, a discreet venture capitalist named Evelyn Hart. She specialized in agricultural acquisitions and had a spotless public record. To the outside world, she'd look like just another investor chasing undervalued farmland. Meanwhile, I stepped up my information gathering. Through a contact at the county registry, I learned that Patricia had mortgaged everything she had left to finance the bid: the mansion, the vineyards, even a townhouse she owned in France. She was betting the family's entire future on winning back those parcels. And that's when I decided to add another layer to my plan. Using a legal loophole, my attorney filed a right of first refusal claim on one of the parcels, a claim Patricia didn't even know existed because Edward had signed it years earlier when we were expanding operations. It was a forgotten clause buried in a 47-page contract. Now it gave me the legal right to match any offer on that property after the auction, effectively cutting her off. For the first time, I allowed myself a small, private smile. Patricia was gathering every dollar she could find. She thought this was her triumphant comeback, but when the auctioneer's gavel fell, the only one rising from the ashes would be me. She would never even see it coming. The closer we got to the auction, the more desperate the Carmichaels became, and the more cracks began to show in their once impenetrable facade. Word spread quickly through the local business community. Patricia was liquidating assets at alarming speed, calling in old favors, and even hosting private investor dinners to beg for capital. I received updates from a trusted friend who still worked in Edward's office. "She's terrified," they whispered over a discreet phone call. "She's promised returns she can't possibly deliver if she loses those parcels." Investors are already questioning her leadership. I could almost picture it. Patricia pacing the grand hallway of the estate, trying to hold together an empire built on arrogance and denial. But one crack cut deeper than the rest, the one between Patricia and Edward. One evening, I received a text from Edward. "Please, can we meet?" "Just talk." Despite every instinct telling me to ignore it, curiosity got the better of me. We met at a quiet cafe we used to frequent when things were simpler, back when we were still a team. He looked exhausted, older than his years. "She's losing control," he admitted, stirring his untouched coffee. "She's blaming everyone, the bank, the lawyers, even me. But deep down, I think she knows she's the reason we're in this mess." I studied his face carefully. "And yet you're still helping her." "She's my mother," he said with a defeated shrug. "I can't just walk away." Then his voice softened. "But part of me wishes I had listened to you. You were always the smart one, the careful one." There was a time when those words would have melted me. Now they just felt hollow. "It's too late for that, Edward. Choices have consequences," he sighed. "If she loses everything, she'll never forgive you." I looked him dead in the eye. "If she loses everything, she'll have no one to blame but herself." As I left the cafe, my heart was heavy but resolute. Whatever love I'd once had for Edward was buried beneath the weight of betrayal and disrespect. The Carmichaels had spent years underestimating me. Now their dynasty was teetering on the edge, and I was about to give it one final, calculated push, a week before the auction. Just as everything seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected blow hit me from the one direction I hadn't anticipated, from inside my own camp. It started with a phone call from Malcolm late one night. His tone was unusually tense. "We have a leak," he said. "Patricia knows Willow and Vine Holdings isn't what it appears to be. She's suspecting you're behind it." My heart skipped a beat. "How? We've been airtight. Who could have said anything?" "I'm still trying to find out," Malcolm replied. "But someone passed documents to her lawyer, partial ownership filings, wire transfers, even your involvement in creating the trust." I felt the blood drain from my face. That kind of information was supposed to be locked down tighter than anything. Only 4 people in the world knew the full plan. Me, Malcolm, Evelyn, and my attorney. If Patricia had it, that meant someone close to me had betrayed me. The next morning I got my answer. My attorney called, his voice heavy with guilt. "I have to tell you, Edward came to see me. He demanded details about the trust, claimed he had the right to know because of the joint marital assets. I tried to refuse, but he threatened legal action. He must have pieced enough together. Edward, the man who once swore he'd stand by me no matter what. The man who had begged for my help weeks earlier. He'd sold me out to his mother. Fury coursed through me, but beneath it there was something colder, sharper, clarity. Patricia was desperate, yes. But now she was scared. And scared people made mistakes. I called Malcolm immediately. "Change of plans," I said. "We shift everything. New proxies, new accounts. Evelyn becomes the front on all bids. And I want the holding company's ownership structure buried 3 layers deep, enough that even the IRS couldn't trace it." He hesitated. "That'll cost more? I don't care." "Do it? They thought they'd cornered me. They thought leaking my plan would stop me. But what Patricia and Edward didn't realize was that I was now done playing by the old rules. If they wanted war, I'd give them a war. I was prepared to scorch the earth to win it. The betrayal lit a fire in me that I hadn't felt before. Not when Patricia humiliated me, not when Edward abandoned me, not even when they called me a jinx. This was different. This was war. I was no longer fighting for dignity. I was fighting to dismantle their power completely. Within 48 hours, Malcolm and I rebuilt the plan from the ground up. We established 2 additional shell companies under separate names, each fronted by trusted partners from Malcolm's network. One would bid on the vineyard parcels. Another would focus on the residential estate lot. Evelyn, still our public bidder, would go after the orchards. By the time the Carmichaels figured out who was behind which bid, the ink would already be dry. But that was just the surface. I wanted something deeper, something that would make them regret ever crossing me. Through my lawyer, I quietly reached out to several creditors Patricia had stiffed over the years, local contractors, suppliers and lenders she'd bullied or underpaid during the estate's expansion. Many were still bitter and eager for retribution. With my help, they filed civil suits and liens against her properties. One by one, small cracks started appearing in the Carmichael Financial Foundation. Then I leaked a carefully curated package of documents, bank transfers, failed deals, and unpaid tax notices, to a respected financial journalist under the condition of anonymity. Within a week, the headline hit the front page of the business section. Carmichael legacy on the brink, hidden debts and desperation behind the vineyard empire. The article spread like wildfire. Investors withdrew. Banks tightened their lending terms. Rumors swirled that the family was insolvent. I knew Patricia was furious. I heard through the grapevine that she'd screamed at Edward for hours, accusing him of incompetence. But more importantly, I knew she was afraid. All her life, Patricia had lived for public image, and now that image was crumbling just as fast as her fortune. For the first time in decades, the Carmichaels weren't the predators. They were prey. And I was tightening the noose. I didn't know exactly how the auction would unfold, but one thing was certain. I was no longer playing defense. From now on, every move I made would strike directly at the heart of their empire, and Patricia would feel every blow. The eve of the auction felt eerily calm, like the heavy electric stillness before a thunderstorm. My apartment was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, papers neatly stacked on the dining table, the final contracts for Willow and Vine and its sister companies signed and sealed. Everything was ready, and yet my heart refused to rest. I stood by the window, staring out over the city lights, replaying every decision that had led me here. Patricia's insults, Edward's betrayal, the humiliation at the family meeting, the years I had spent building their empire from behind the scenes, only to be cast aside as the villain when things fell apart. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just win land. I would take back the power they'd stolen from me. Malcolm stopped by just before midnight, 2 cups of strong coffee in hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked, setting one on the table. I shook my head. Too much running through my mind. If we win tomorrow, Patricia will never recover. If we lose, he smiled knowingly. If we lose, you still walk away with your dignity. You've already exposed their corruption and stripped away their illusion of invincibility. They're bleeding, whether they admit it or not. I nodded, but deep down I wanted more than dignity. I wanted finality. I wanted Patricia to stand on the courthouse steps, trembling as she realized the woman she had mocked and dismissed now owned the soil beneath her feet. Before he left, Malcolm placed a sealed envelope in my hand. "Emergency fund," he said. "If the bidding gets higher than expected, you'll have an extra cushion." I blinked back tears, gratitude mixing with adrenaline. "Thank you, Malcolm." "For everything," he smiled. "Tomorrow, we finish this." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet and wrote a single sentence on a piece of paper, one I intended to frame after the auction. I am not their scapegoat. I am their reckoning. Then I slid it into my purse, next to the power of attorney documents and bidding authorization forms. At 6 a.m., I would step into the auction hall as a silent observer. But by noon, if everything went according to plan, I would walk out the owner of every acre Patricia had sworn I'd never touch. The battle was hours away, and I was ready to win it. The next morning, the city was still waking up when I arrived at the courthouse steps, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that made me feel untouchable. My hair was tied back in a sleek bun, my posture straight, my expression unreadable. This wasn't the timid daughter-in-law they'd laughed at. This was the woman they should have feared all along. The auction hall was already buzzing with whispers when I walked in. Investors, lawyers, bankers, everyone knew this was no ordinary property sale. Millions were at stake, and the fall of the Carmichael dynasty had become the talk of the town. In the front row sat Patricia, flanked by Olivia and Margot, all of them wearing masks of forced confidence. Edward was beside them, eyes darting nervously around the room. When he spotted me in the back row, his expression faltered. A flicker of guilt, maybe fear. Patricia, however, didn't even glance in my direction. I was beneath her notice, just as she'd always believed. "Lot 1, the auctioneer announced, tapping his gavel. "Carmichael West Vineyard, 120 acres, opening bid, $4.5 million. The room went silent for a moment before Patricia's lawyer raised a placard. "5 million. Evelyn, seated 3 rows ahead of me as the face of our investment group waited a beat before countering. 5.5. The bidding began in earnest, sharp, fast, calculated. Patricia pushed harder than I expected, climbing in $500,000 increments with the aggression of someone who couldn't afford to lose. I watched her, stone-faced, as Evelyn and our second proxy tag-teamed their responses, driving the price higher without revealing their connection. When the gavel finally fell, Evelyn had secured the vineyard at $7.2 million. Patricia's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Her empire had just lost its crown jewel. The next 2 lots followed a similar pattern: Orchard, Northridge parcel. Each time, Patricia bid furiously. Each time, she lost. By the time Lot 4, the old family homestead, came up, the cracks were visible. Patricia's lawyer whispered frantically to her. Olivia looked pale. Edward had his head in his hands. When Evelyn placed the winning bid at $3.1 million, I allowed myself the smallest, most satisfying smile. This was no longer a simple property sale. This was a public execution, and the Carmichaels were watching their legacy die one gavel strike at a time. And the woman wielding the hammer? She was sitting quietly in the back row. By the time the final parcel was called, the once proud Carmichael matriarch looked like a ghost of herself. The woman who had once swept into rooms with an air of untouchable superiority was now slumped in her chair, fingers trembling around the bidding paddle. Sweat beaded at her temple. She knew she was losing more than land. She was losing everything. Lot 5, the South Estate House, including 50 acres and the historical vineyard structures, the auctioneer declared. Opening bid $3.5 million, Patricia hesitated. It was clear she was running out of capital. The investors she had charmed with promises of easy returns had likely abandoned ship after reading the damaging news articles I had carefully seeded. When she finally lifted her paddle, her voice was shaky. 3.6. Evelyn raised her placard immediately. $4 million. 4.2, Patricia countered, desperation seeping into every syllable. I glanced at Malcolm across the room. He gave the slightest nod, the signal we had agreed upon. Evelyn raised the paddle once more. 4.8. Patricia's lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically. She shook her head. Do it, she hissed. Sell the townhouse. Liquidate the trust. Just win this one. But they couldn't. They were out of money. And we knew it. The room held its breath as the auctioneer's voice rang out. Going once. Going twice. Sold for $4.8 million to Willow and Vine Holdings. The gavel fell with a heavy crack, echoing like a final death knell for the Carmichael dynasty. Patricia's paddle slipped from her hand and clattered onto the floor. Olivia buried her face in her hands. Margot muttered something bitter under her breath. Edward stared at the ground, shoulders slumped. It was over. All 5 properties, the heart of their legacy, now belonged to me. I walked past them as I exited the auction hall, keeping my steps measured and my face expressionless. Near the door, I paused just long enough to glance back. Patricia was staring at the deeds Evelyn now held, her family's empire reduced to a stack of papers in a stranger's hands. And for the first time in all the years I'd known her eyes were full of fear. She still didn't know it was me who had orchestrated every piece of her downfall. But she would soon. And when she did, the humiliation would be complete. The courthouse steps were buzzing with cameras and reporters by the time the auction ended. The collapse of the Carmichael estate wasn't just a business story. It was front-page drama. A dynasty that had ruled the region's wine industry for nearly a century had been dismantled in less than 2 hours. And no one knew who the mysterious buyer, Willow and Vine Holdings, really was. I stayed back in the shadows, watching Patricia as she stepped out of the building. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the world had finally settled on her shoulders. Olivia clutched her arm, guiding her past the reporters, while Edward kept his head down. But the questions followed them like vultures circling a dying animal. Mrs. Carmichael, how does it feel to lose the entire estate? Did financial mismanagement play a role? Who do you blame for this downfall? Patricia didn't answer a single question. She just pressed her lips into a thin line and kept walking, her heels clicking furiously against the stone steps. But I knew her silence wasn't strength, it was rage. And that rage was about to meet reality. 2 days later, the official transfer notices were filed with the county registrar. It was time for the second phase of my plan, the reveal. I arranged a meeting at the estate's legal office, requesting Patricia's presence for transition discussions. She showed up with Edward and her lawyer, still clinging to some illusion of control. She expected a nameless corporate representative from Willow and Vine. Instead, she found me. The room froze. "You?" she spat, her face flushing scarlet. "This is some kind of joke, June Whitlow." "No joke," I said calmly, sliding the ownership documents across the table. "As of this morning, Willow and Vine Holdings, which I control, owns 96% of the former Carmichael estate. The vineyards, the orchards, the homestead. All of it." Edward's eyes widened in shock. Olivia gasped audibly. Patricia, however, went very still, too still. Then she laughed, a brittle, trembling sound. "You think this means you've won?" she hissed. "You may have the land, but you'll never be part of this family." I met her glare with an icy smile. "I don't want to be part of your family. I want what I earned, and now I have it." Her lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in our long, bitter history, Patricia Carmichael had nothing left to say. And it was glorious. The silence that followed my reveal was heavier than any insult Patricia had ever hurled at me. For a moment, the room stood frozen, a tableau of disbelief and humiliation. Olivia's mouth hung open. Margot turned pale, and Edward looked like he'd been physically punched. But Patricia just stared at the deeds on the table, as though they were written in a language she couldn't comprehend. "This isn't over," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "We'll fight this. We'll sue. On what grounds?" I interrupted softly. Everything was legal. Every document, every bid, every payment. Flawless. I played by the same rules you did, Patricia. The difference is, I played better. Her lawyer cleared his throat. "She's correct. There's nothing to contest here. The ownership transfers are legitimate. Any lawsuit would be frivolous and costly." Patricia's face twisted into something almost unrecognizable, a mixture of fury, humiliation, and panic. "You've ruined us," she hissed. "You've destroyed this family." I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but razor-sharp. "No, Patricia. You destroyed this family the day you chose pride over people, greed over gratitude. I just collected the pieces you left behind." Edward finally spoke, his voice hollow. "So, what happens now?" "Now," I said, sliding the final document across the table. "Now I'm your landlord. If you wish to continue operating the vineyard or live on any portion of the property, you'll pay market rent. If you want to buy anything back, you'll do it on my terms. And if you refuse," I shrugged. "You can leave," Olivia gasped. Margot started crying. But Patricia just stared at me with eyes full of venom and fear. "Get used to the view from the other side of power," I said as I stood. "Because that's where you'll be from now on." As I left the room, a strange calm settled over me. This was more than revenge, it was justice. Every humiliation, every insult, every time they called me nothing had led to this moment. And now they were the ones stripped of everything. But even as I walked away victorious, I knew the story wasn't over. Patricia was too proud to surrender quietly, and I had a feeling the reckoning was just around the corner. I should have known Patricia wouldn't go quietly. Pride like hers doesn't accept defeat. It festers, it plots, it claws for any scrap of control. And sure enough, just 1 week after our confrontation, a thick envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a summons. Patricia Carmichael was suing me for fraudulent interference, undue influence, and theft of family property. I laughed when I read the claims. They were weak, desperate, a collection of baseless accusations designed more to drag me through public mud than to actually win in court. But I also knew Patricia's real goal wasn't victory. It was vengeance. Malcolm and my attorney were furious. "This is a smear campaign," my lawyer said, slapping the documents on the table. She knows she has no case, but if this goes to trial, the headlines will be ugly. Investors might panic. Let her try, I said coldly. She's about to learn the cost of playing games she doesn't understand. And so, for the next several weeks, we prepared. My legal team meticulously dismantled every accusation, producing documentation of every transaction, every bank transfer, every meeting. Evelyn testified that all bids were made legally and transparently. Even the bank that handled the auction issued a statement confirming that no wrongdoing had occurred. But the true death blow came from an unexpected source, Patricia's own accountant. Subpoenaed by the court, he testified that Patricia had knowingly misrepresented the family's finances to investors and had diverted trust funds to cover her gambling debts. Not only did it destroy her credibility, but it opened her to criminal investigation for financial misconduct. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the final decision, case dismissed with prejudice. Not only did Patricia lose the lawsuit, but she was ordered to pay all my legal fees, a sum so large it would require selling the last piece of property she still owned outright, her beloved townhouse in the city. I should have felt triumphant. I had crushed her final attempt to ruin me. But as I watched her sink into her chair, pale and trembling, I realized something deeper had shifted. Patricia wasn't just losing land anymore, she was losing herself. Her power, her influence, her dignity. All of it was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. The queen of the Carmichael Empire had been reduced to a woman fighting ghosts and losing. If Patricia's courtroom defeat was the legal end of her reign, the public fallout that followed was its funeral. Within days of the ruling, the media coverage exploded. Newspapers and business journals published scathing headlines. Carmichael dynasty collapses amid scandal and debt. Matriarch loses vineyard, fortune, and lawsuit to former daughter-in-law. From prestige to pariah. How pride brought down a legacy. Her name, once synonymous with class and influence, had become a cautionary tale. Invitations to elite social events dried up. Longtime business partners severed ties. Even the family's old friends stopped returning calls. In a matter of weeks, Patricia went from powerful matriarch to social exile. I didn't plan the timing of the fallout, but I couldn't deny it felt poetic. All those years she had wielded shame like a weapon, belittling me in public, mocking my background, calling me a jinx. Now, it was her name that drew whispers and pitying glances. One afternoon, while I was touring one of the vineyard parcels I now owned, I spotted her car parked at the edge of the property. Patricia stood there alone, staring at the rows of vines she no longer controlled. Her posture was stiff, but her eyes betrayed her. They were red and swollen, the eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days. I considered ignoring her, but something in me, not cruelty, but curiosity, made me walk over. "This used to be ours," she said quietly when she saw me. "Now I'm not even allowed past the fence without permission." I nodded. "That's how property law works, Patricia." She let out a bitter laugh. "Do you feel powerful now, watching me like this?" I paused before answering. "No, power isn't about watching someone fall. It's about standing tall after they tried to break you." She didn't respond. She just turned back toward the vines, her shoulders sagging. "I thought money could fix everything," she murmured. "Turns out it can take everything too." For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the years of cruelty, the humiliation, the way she had reduced me to nothing. I walked away without another word. Patricia Carmichael was finally facing the consequences of her own arrogance. And I, the woman she once dismissed as irrelevant, was now the one writing the next chapter of the story. And this time, she was just a footnote. The day of the property's re-auction was overcast, with rain clouds brooding above the grand estate, as if the heavens themselves knew something monumental was about to happen. Patricia arrived in a muted gray suit, her pearl necklace trembling slightly against her throat. This was her last chance to reclaim a shred of what she had lost. I could see it in her eyes, desperation mixed with pride. The auction hall buzzed with murmurs. Reporters had gathered, investors were seated, and rival families whispered about the infamous Carmichael downfall. Patricia sat in the front row, clutching her bidder's card like a lifeline. Every few minutes she shot me a venomous glance, as if willing me to vanish. The bidding began at $10 million, a fraction of the estate's true worth. Patricia raised her card almost immediately. $11 million. Another bidder raised to $12 million. Patricia countered with $13 million. Her hands were trembling now. She was stretching far beyond what she could afford. Then I raised my card. $15 million. The room gasped. Patricia's head snapped toward me, eyes wide with disbelief. "You!" she hissed under her breath. "You're behind this?" I didn't respond. I simply kept my gaze fixed on the auctioneer. 16, Patricia countered, her voice strained. 18, I replied, calm and deliberate. Her face drained of color. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, calculating loans, liquid assets, and debts. She knew she couldn't go higher, not without destroying what little remained of her fortune. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold. For $18 million. Silence swept the room. Patricia sank into her chair, defeated. And in that moment, the narrative shifted forever. I was no longer the outsider. I was the owner. And Patricia Carmichael had just lost everything, to the woman she once called a jinx. The morning after the auction, the papers were signed, sealed, and filed. The estate that Patricia's family had controlled for 3 generations, the one she had sworn I would never be part of, now bore my name on the title deed. When the legal clerk handed me the documents, embossed and official, I ran my fingers over the seal. Across the top, in bold block letters, it read, June Whitlow, Trustee, Willow and Vine Holdings. It wasn't just property. It was vindication. A tangible reminder of every insult, every humiliation, every whispered comment that I didn't belong. Later that afternoon, I visited the estate alone. The iron gates that once swung open only for the Carmichael family now parted for me. The sprawling vineyard stretched across the horizon, bathed in the soft gold of the setting sun. Every acre, every brick of the main house, every oak tree that lined the drive was now mine. But this victory wasn't just about ownership. It was about rewriting history. Patricia had thrown me out of family dinners, laughed at my ideas, called me a curse when the family finances crumbled. Now the woman who once looked down on me would have to live with the knowledge that the legacy she'd tried to protect was in my hands. As I walked through the marble foyer of the mansion, I paused by a large portrait of Patricia and her late husband. In it, they stood proudly in front of the very estate I now owned. For a brief second, I considered taking it down. But then I smiled and left it exactly where it was, because from now on, that portrait wasn't a symbol of their legacy. It was a monument to how arrogance and cruelty had led to their downfall, and how the woman they dismissed as nothing had become the architect of their family's new future. It was 3 days after the auction when Patricia appeared, at the estate uninvited. The staff hesitated to let her in, but I told them to open the gates. Part of me wanted this meeting, not out of spite, but because I knew she needed to see what losing everything looked like up close. She walked into the main hall like a ghost of the woman she once was. The confident matriarch who used to glide through this mansion with her chin held high was gone. In her place stood someone smaller, thinner, and deeply shaken. Her pearls were gone. Her designer bag was replaced by something plain. Even her voice, when she finally spoke, was softer than I remembered. So, she said, scanning the room, this is what victory looks like for you. I kept my tone even. It's not about victory, Patricia. It's about justice. Justice? She spat, the venom returning for just a moment. You destroyed this family. I took a step closer. I didn't destroy anything. You did, when you refused to listen, when you blamed me for your son's mistakes, when you pushed me out and called me a curse. I warned you about the debt, the overspending, the bad deals. You laughed. She looked away, ashamed but defiant. We could have fixed it. Together. No, I said quietly. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a scapegoat. For a long moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of decades between us. Finally, she whispered, I have nowhere else to go. There it was. Not arrogance, but desperation. And while a part of me still ached from everything she'd done, another part remembered the woman who once, however briefly, had been family. I'm not your enemy, I said softly, but things will never go back to how they were. Patricia's admission hung in the air like a ghost neither of us could ignore. She was stripped of the pride and superiority that had once defined her, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked human, vulnerable. Then what do you want from me? She asked, her voice trembling. An apology? My dignity? I've lost everything else. I don't want anything from you, I said, my tone calm but firm. I want accountability and the truth. Not the lies you tell at dinner parties or the excuses you've made to yourself. The truth. She sank into one of the leather chairs in the drawing room, the same one where she'd once told me I would never belong to this family. I hated you, she said finally. From the day you married my son, you were too independent, too outspoken. I thought you were here to take what we built. And yet I was the one trying to save it, I replied. I put my money into this house, my ideas into the vineyard, my energy into keeping the company afloat. You called me a jinx when things went wrong, but I was the only one still fighting for it. Tears slipped down her cheeks, an image I never thought I'd see. I was wrong, she whispered. I see that now. If I had listened to you, maybe none of this would have happened. For a moment, I was silent, weighing her words. Part of me wanted to hold on to the anger, to let it keep burning as a reminder. But the truth was, vengeance had already done its work. I didn't need her destruction anymore. I forgive you, I said finally, steady and controlled. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean I'll ever hand back what I've earned. She nodded slowly, the weight of those words settling on her shoulders like a sentence. Patricia stayed seated, her hands clasped tightly together as if she were bracing for a final blow. But I wasn't interested in cruelty, not anymore. Power had shifted, and I didn't need to humiliate her to prove it. There are conditions, I continued, pacing slowly across the polished marble floor. This estate is no longer a family fiefdom. It's governed, board, trust, oversight. If you want to be involved, you'll apply and serve like anyone else. No special privileges, and you'll acknowledge the truth, publicly, that I didn't destroy this family. I saved what was left. Her eyes widened slightly, the reality of her new position dawning on her. So that's it? I'm to be a stranger in the house I built? No, I said, pausing in front of the fireplace where the Carmichael family crest still hung. You can be part of it, but only as long as you accept that I am the one steering the future now. This property, this company, this legacy, they're under my stewardship. You can be here as a guest, not a ruler. Patricia swallowed hard, pride warring with pragmatism. And if I accept those terms? Then you'll have a place here, I answered. Not the one you imagined, but one built on honesty and mutual respect. And you might even see the vineyard flourish again, under leadership that actually understands how to protect it. Silence stretched between us for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. I accept, she whispered. I don't have the strength to fight anymore, and perhaps it's time someone else led. It wasn't surrender, not entirely, but it was close enough. And for the first time since the auction, I saw something in her expression that wasn't anger or resentment. It was relief. As she stood to leave, I offered my hand. Welcome to the new Carmichael legacy, I said softly. It's different, but it's stronger. And, hesitantly, Patricia shook it. 2 weeks later, I stood at the heart of the vineyard beneath the same white canopy where Patricia had once hosted her annual Carmichael Estate galas. Only this time it wasn't her event, it was mine. Investors, local officials, wine distributors, and family members filled the space, their chatter a soft hum beneath the autumn sky. When I stepped up to the podium, a hush fell, All eyes were on me, the outsider who had once been dismissed, belittled, and publicly humiliated, now the woman in charge. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady. "This land has stood for over a century. It has survived droughts, economic crashes, and family conflicts. But what matters most isn't its past, it's what we build next." I let the words hang before continuing. "Today, I'm proud to announce a new chapter. The Carmichael Estate is no longer just a family business. It's becoming a community trust, focused on sustainable agriculture, local employment, and building a legacy that benefits everyone, not just those who inherited it." The crowd erupted in applause. Even Patricia, seated at the front, though visibly uncomfortable, joined in politely. I caught her eye, and for the first time she didn't look at me with disdain. There was something closer to acknowledgement there, even if pride wouldn't let her admit it aloud. As the speeches continued and cameras flashed, I stood off to the side, gazing out over the vineyards. The same land that had once been a weapon used against me was now a symbol of everything I'd overcome. This wasn't revenge. This was transformation. The property was no longer the Carmichael's fortress. It was a legacy I was shaping with my own hands. And this time, no one could take it from me. A month later, she arrived at my office thinner, steadier. We signed the governance papers, board applications, conflict of interest rules, public statement draft. No tears, no speeches, just the work of starting over. 2 weeks later, Patricia stood beside me on the main stage at the annual Wine Expo, the largest public event the Carmichael Estate had hosted in years. Cameras flashed from every angle, reporters whispered in anticipation, and guests craned their necks to see the woman who had once scorned me, now sharing a platform with the outsider she had despised. When the moderator handed her the microphone, Patricia's fingers trembled slightly, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "For many years," she began, "I believed that protecting this family's legacy meant keeping outsiders away. I saw anyone who wasn't born a Carmichael as a threat. And because of that, I treated someone who should have been family as an enemy." The room fell silent. "I was wrong," she continued. "The woman standing beside me, the woman I blamed for our financial collapse, did not destroy our legacy. She saved it. She preserved the land that 3 generations built. She turned our tragedy into a future. I stood motionless, my heart pounding." Those were words I had dreamed of hearing, but never truly expected. Patricia turned toward me and handed me the microphone with a small nod. "Thank you," I said simply, meeting the gaze of every person in that room. "This isn't a story about revenge or about winning. It's about rebuilding something that was broken, not just a business, but a family. We can't change what happened, but we can decide what happens next." The crowd erupted into applause, some for the success of the vineyard, others for the rare sight of humility and reconciliation. But for me, the loudest sound was the quiet peace that finally settled inside. Patricia stepped closer and, for the first time ever, embraced me in front of everyone. And in that moment, the feud that had defined our lives finally ended. Months passed, and the vineyard, once drowning in debt and scandal, blossomed into a thriving enterprise. Under my leadership, the Carmichael Estate wasn't just profitable, it was respected again. New partnerships were forged, exports tripled, and our flagship vintage won a gold medal at an international wine competition. Investors who had once backed away were now begging to get in. But success wasn't just measured in numbers. The land itself was alive again. Families visited for weekend tours. Students from the local university interned in our sustainability program, and the once closed gates of the estate were now open to the community. It was no longer just their vineyard. It had become something larger, a legacy reimagined. Patricia kept her promise. She joined the estate board, not as a matriarch pulling strings, but as a contributor. She led historical tours for visitors, and often shared stories of the vineyard's past, always giving me credit for the future we had built. The first few times, I could see how hard those words were for her, but gradually they became easier, more genuine. One afternoon, as we walked through rows of ripe grapes ready for harvest, she stopped and turned to me. "You know," she said, softly, "this place is more beautiful now than it's ever been. And it's not just because of the vines or the buildings. It's because you built it with something I never could. Heart." Her words caught me off guard. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past finally lift. "We built it together," I replied. For the first time since I'd married into the Carmichael family, I truly felt like I belonged. And not because I had proven myself to them, but because I had proven that strength, courage, and vision could rebuild even the most broken legacy. The annual Harvest Festival was more crowded than ever that autumn. Journalists, investors, and townsfolk all gathered to celebrate the vineyard's transformation. Lanterns bobbed above the rows. Kids chased each other between barrels. Volunteers poured tastings for visitors who lingered at dusk. I kept my toast short and personal, then stepped down from the platform to mingle. After the ceremony, she approached me quietly. "You did what none of us could," she admitted. "You saved not just the land, but our name." I smiled gently. "It's our name, Patricia, and I never wanted to erase it, only honor it differently." She drew me into a quiet, unhurried hug. No audience, no performance. It didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it into something useful. Later, that night, as I walked through the vineyards under the stars, I whispered a small promise to myself. I would protect this legacy, not for revenge, not even for validation, but because I had built it from the ashes of cruelty and doubt. I raised a glass under the moonlight. "To second chances," I murmured. And for the first time since marrying into this family, the word home finally felt like the truth. Not a place I had to fight for, but one I had earned. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.